So last year I had the privilege to spend some time in Poland. It was in Krakow. I did an Airbnb experience with Karina, and she taught us how to make pierogies. This is her recipe, and I will link to her recipe online. But basically, you take 300 grams of flour. To that, we're going to add half a teaspoon of salt. We're going to add 125 ml of very warm water. Give that a stir. We're going to add 20 grams of olive oil, or you could use softened butter, as well as an egg. And then you're just going to stir that up, give it a really good stir until it's really well combined, and then you'll kind of swap across and knead it with your hands. You could take it out of the bowl and knead it on the bench, but it was fine enough for me to just knead it directly in the bowl. And once it's kneaded, you're going to put it aside. You're going to cover it with cling film and put it aside. Then we're going to chop up some potatoes. This is 500 grams of potatoes. Just want to cut it into roughly even sized pieces. You could, and you probably should, peel the potatoes, but I don't mind the rusticness of having a bit of skin in the mix. So I usually don't bother actually peeling them. Once peeled, throw them in a pot and then filter cover with water. From here, we simply want to bring them up to the boil and then simmer them for 10 to 15 minutes until they're quite tender. You're also going to fry off one chopped onion. I'm sure you know how to chop an onion, so I'm not showing that. But here you can see I'm adding that to a pan next to this one. Just a little bit of olive oil, a little bit of salt, fairly low temperature, and we're just going to sort of cook them down a little bit. We don't want any color until they're nice and soft. And it should take about the same amount of time as it does for the potatoes to be soft. Once the potatoes are soft, you're going to want to drain them, and you're going to add the onion mix into the potatoes. And then you're going to add 150 grams of cottage cheese. In Poland, they have a very specific type of farmer's cheese they use, but cottage cheese is a fairly good substitute elsewhere. And you're going to give that a really good stir. Ideally, you've got a potato masher. I don't, it broke. And so I'm just going to mix it really hard with these chopsticks. And then I'll switch to a whisk where I'll kind of mash it up the rest of the way. But you do get a better end result if you actually have a potato masher. Next, we're going to portion off a small amount of the dough, and we're actually going to make a test batch of pierogi before we actually make the full batch. So hopefully you have a rolling pin. If not, you can use a wine bottle, and you're just going to roll it out. You want it to be fairly thin, not quite the paper thinness of like a lasagna sheet, but fairly thin. And once you're fairly happy with the thickness of the dough, you need to cut some round pieces. I actually like to use the top of a cocktail shaker. It's about the right size and the edges are quite sharp. Remove the dough from around the rounds and we are ready for stuffing. To stuff the pierogi, you want to take a couple of teaspoons and kind of just roughly shape the mix, the stuffing mix. And then you're just going to do this first one, wet the outside of the rim of the round, and then you're going to kind of fold up one side over the top of the stuffing to touch the edge of the other side. You don't want any of the stuffing caught between the edge where it forms a seam. Otherwise, you may have an issue with it leaking out because you want to be able to form a fairly tight seal. Sometimes it takes a few goes to figure out the right amount of stuffing to use. Err on the side of less. You can always add more as you get more confident and comfortable. But once you feel like you've got a pretty good seal around the edges, you're going to grab a fork and you can use the fork to crimp the outside edge. You want to be careful you don't poke holes where the filling is, which I have done before. And so you're just crimping around the edges fairly carefully and gently. You should use enough flour on the board so that it pops up easily. You can see I just have to pop it out with the scraper there. Normally you shouldn't have to do that. And then just to be safe, you just give it a quick dusting in flour just to make sure it's not going to stick to anything. So you're going to repeat the process on a second one and just, you're really trying to get a good feel for how much filling to use and how easy it is to fold the dough. So you're just doing them one at a time to start with. And you can see here, I'm sort of doing this one quicker than I did the first one. You do fairly quickly get into a rhythm. And once you've made a couple, you can now sort of start going into bulk production mode and do a bunch at a time. If you want to, you can dip the bottom of the pierogi flats into a bowl of flour just to make sure there's plenty of flour on the bottom. Any excess flour is going to wash off when you cook them anyway, so it's not a big deal. And then you're just going to go ahead and stuff them. You're going to wet the outside rim. It's not absolutely essential to do that, but I do find it helps them stick together and you have less actually leak if you take the time to do that. And then you're going to fold them over real quick, and you're going to do that across all three. And then once all three are done, you'll get the fork and you will crimp them. And so that's getting a taste of how you'll sort of get into production mode for the rest of the pierogies. And that's done. So you can see I've got 5 pierogies here, all reasonably well shaped. So the next thing to do is do a test cook and make sure that they're not going to leak, make sure the consistency is right, etc. So to do that, you want to boil them. So you're going to bring a small pot of water to the boil. You're going to salt that water, and you're going to put a drop of olive oil in that water, which can just act as insurance to stop them sticking together. Then add them a couple at a time, being fairly gentle. And then once they're in, you want to make sure you stay at a fairly low simmer. You don't want a lot of movement in there. You don't want them to jostle and potentially break each other apart. Cook time should be right on 5 minutes. And you can see they don't often float to the top. And when they do, they sometimes float to the top quite early. So some other things like gnocchi, they say when it floats to the top, it's ready. Not quite the case with pierogi. So you definitely want to make sure you give them a good 5 minutes. So here we have our test batch of pierogies are cooked. Obviously, you want to test them and make sure that they are delicious. A good way to do the taste test is just add a squeeze of sour cream and a little bit of bacon. And that kind of gives you a good idea of the taste and everything. So now that we've made our test batch, let's talk about mass production. See, I think you make like 40 or 50 with this amount of dough, and you can hand roll that out. But if you have a pasta roller, you can also use that. So what I'm doing here is I'm running it through once on the widest setting, which is setting 7, then again on 5, and then I'll do it one more time on 3. And that gets me to about the right thickness that I like for my pierogies. If you're daring, you could go down to a 2. I think 1 would be a little bit too thin. And so you're going to do that for all of your dough. I've done it in like, I think 4 sets of sheets. So once you've rolled out your dough, you're then going to cut it out and then just put the cutouts somewhere and just go through the dough. It's a good idea to dip them in your flour bowl as you stack them up so that they don't stick together. And then you'll just keep doing that until you get through all of the dough. The excess dough that you've cut off, you can re-roll and continue to use until you get to the point you don't really have enough dough worth rolling. Next is assembly. So get a fairly large cutting board or tray, lay them all out, as many as will fit. And then just brush them down with water. There's nothing wrong with brushing down the whole top, and it saves you trying to go around the edges. Just you don't want to get your board too wet because you don't want them to stick to your board. Once that's done, you're going to add the pierogi stuffing, and then you're going to fold them. And then finally, you're going to crimp them all at the end. You can see here I've just got a couple left. You can see I've put them all on this tray that I have lined with baking paper. This tray I'm going to throw straight in the freezer like this until they're quite well frozen. Then I'm going to break them up into individual Ziploc bags and freeze them again.